Hi everybody, this is Bob Cox. Let's take a look today at creating some basic textures in watercolor, and while we do that we're going to learn how to control the paint on the paper. Before we start though, let's look at the basic materials that I use to paint. I have a collection of round and flat brushes, assorted sizes. They're all synthetic watercolor brushes, except for one oil painter's bristle brush that I use to soften edges. I use an old pocket knife, very dull, to scrape marks with, and a chopped up credit card also to scrape and squeegee out lighter areas. I have some paper towels for blotting and some tissues for the same reason. I keep a spritz bottle handy to spray my paints and keep them moist. I have some large buckets full of water and a sponge for soaking up extra water. I use a palette with big deep wells and mixing areas in the middle. I've got it arranged so that all my yellows are along one side, all my reds down the adjacent side, and all the blues, purples, and greens on the other two sides. I keep it covered when I'm not painting. I paint on a piece of 1/8 inch masonite with plastic bonded to the front of it, and I just clip my watercolor paper with some big office supply clips, big spring clips, right onto the backing board. If while I'm painting that paper buckles or gets crooked, I can just reset those clips and flatten the paper out again, and it'll stay pretty flat. I'm painting on cold press watercolor paper. It has a little texture to it. It's a little bit bumpy, not real smooth. I'm painting almost straight up so you can see it, but you should probably tip the top of your board up about 15 degrees or so. Okay, let's look at how to create some basic textures. To make hard or smooth edge texture, we take a brush full of juicy paint and keep the brush about right angles to the paper, pretty perpendicular or 90 degrees to the paper. This gives us hard or smooth edges. If we take the same brush full of paint, then fold a paper towel and take the excess moisture out of the bottom of the brush, like this, that will dry the brush out some and will let us paint what's called dry brush or rough texture. Looks like this. I almost got it too dry. You can see that it's broken color. You can also fill it full of paint and then lay one side of the brush on a paper towel and paint with the other side. That's another way to create dry brush, rough texture. Third way is to fill your brush with paint and then just drag it almost flat or parallel to the paper. It skips along the hills and valleys in the rough paper and gives you rough texture. So there's 3 ways to make rough texture. Now if I wet this paper with clear water so that it's damp, then any pigment that I put on there is going to flow and have soft edges. It'll look like this. It's going to move around by the force of gravity just on its own. Any other color I add will also flow and blend with what's there. Here's a third color. This creates the beautiful diffusions that everybody enjoys about watercolor, painting on wet paper. As long as it stays soaking wet, I can move things around or add darker pigment, and I won't create any problems. Now let's look at how to control paint on wet paper. Sometimes we'd like to have those soft edges, but still keep a shape that's recognizable and keep some control of it. So I'm going to wet the paper first, like I did before, and we'll paint a little evergreen tree. Now the paper's wet, so the paint's flowing around. But if I get some rich pigment and then take the excess moisture out, just like I did up above, then you'll see that the paint pretty much stays where I put it. It has a soft edge. It'll blend a little bit, but it doesn't flow all over the place. So I'm just going to mix some greens, take the excess moisture out of my brush, and keep on painting my little tree here. Still getting soft edges, still getting some mixing on the paper, but it's not just running and drooling all over the place. If I use gooier paint, less water, I'll get a darker value. I just keep adding and messing with the edges of this form until I get something that suits me and looks enough like a tree. Now I've got my pocket knife, and I'm going to scrape in a tree trunk, sort of, and a few little branches or suggestions of branches. And that'll pretty much finish my little painting. So there you have dry on wet painting. Practice these textures and the techniques I've shown you. They're very basic. They'll serve you well. So try to learn how to master them, and happy painting to you.